I think I'll start by reading the first page and a half of the book. I have no better way to introduce the topic than this. I thought long and hard about it, and it's the best introduction that I got. So let's just start with that, and then I'll go off script a little and talk about the themes of the book. The best view of Edirne, Turkey is from Greece. Should you find yourself approaching the border town of Castanhès on European Route E85, scan the checkerboard of brown and green fields to the east. Beyond Greek Castanhès, chestnut, and Turkish Karaağaç, elm, between the Thracian plain in the foreground and the Stranja mountains in the background, a massive four-minaret mosque looms on a hill over the sleepy borderland, pompously overdressed for the occasion. This is Selimiye, the dominant feature of Edirne's otherwise modest skyline. Upon its completion in 1575, Selimiye was the largest mosque in the Ottoman Empire. By choosing to build his namesake monument in Edirne, the former capital, instead of Istanbul, the contemporary one, Sultan Selim II may have been recognizing Edirne as the empire's second most important city. After all, it was the frequent home of the Sultan's court and the staging ground for military campaigns that had pushed the imperial frontier to the meadows between Budapest and Vienna, 700 miles away. Historians list several factors that could have motivated Selim II to build his mosque in Edirne, but improving the view for people in a foreign country is not one of them. With a population of 180,000, Edirne is now a secondary city, known mostly for its monumental Ottoman architecture and its border checkpoints with two European Union member states, Bulgaria and Greece. Its difficult passage from central city to border town started in the 19th century when the Ottomans began their piecemeal retreat from Europe. By 1908, an official state border existed just north of the city. Over the next 14 years, that border would move back and forth across Edirne, wreaking havoc in the process. When the Ottoman Empire officially dissolved in 1923, the city found itself in a new country called the Republic of Turkey. At that point, the border stopped moving, but the borderland continued to be a place where, quote, the future is always uncertain, as a local Jew had said in 1910. For Edirne residents, the first decades of the 20th century were largely defined by the shifting position and meaning of the state border. Compared to their Muslim and Christian neighbors, the Jews of Edirne, both the city and the larger province, experienced the border in ways that tended to be less bloody but more complex. On the eve of the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, Edirne province was home to one of the world's oldest and largest communities of Ladino-speaking Sephardim, Jews who traced their lineage to medieval Spain and Portugal. These people dodged a series of ethnic cleansing campaigns that targeted Muslims and then Christians in the period 1912 to 1922. But in 1934, Jews across the region, which had come to be called Eastern Thrace, were attacked by neighbors in a week of violence that prompted a Jewish exodus from the borderland, but killed no Jews. The so-called Thrace events, Trakya olayları, remain the only case of mob violence against Jews in the history of the Turkish Republic. How did Edirne's Jewish community survive the horrors of the last Ottoman decade only to unravel during the relatively peaceful years of the early Turkish Republic? That is a central question of this book. The answers have much to do with the border, the identities it could and could not generate, the violence it could and could not legitimate, and the survival strategies pursued by local Jews within this tricky matrix. So that's the opening of the book, and in the book you'll see this photo taken by a friend of mine, which shows you what I just described. This is Edirne, most notably the Selimiye Mosque, as seen from Greece. Right? So this is just to give you a visual sense of the border, Edirne's border city situation today, which was not the case for much of its history. On the contrary, it was a very central Ottoman city. So some of the themes of the book that I think you just heard: a central place becoming a borderland, the uneven effects that this process had on different ethno-religious groups and the complicated relationship between Jews and violence in this part of the world. The book also starts with 5 maps, and here I want to give credit to my friend Cem Dinlenmiş. You can see his name in the corner. He's an artist living in Istanbul. We made these maps together. I couldn't find such maps that really show you step by step the way this region changed from 1877 to 1923. And so we'll start with just that. This is 1877, right before a sort of disastrous war, disastrous for the Ottomans, that is, between the Ottoman Empire and Russia. And the border you see is just the border of Edirne province. Everything in this map, I mean, aside for this bottom left corner, is the Ottoman Empire. So in the beginning of the book, I emphasize that for much of its history, Edirne was an extremely diverse place in the heart of Ottoman Europe. Meanwhile, the province had a Christian majority. Here we jump to 1908. The map has changed considerably. So these thick dotted lines, the thick broken lines, show you state borders. So now the Ottoman Empire is sort of reduced to kind of this swath in the middle. Bulgaria has emerged as a new country. Greece, border is over here. So in 1908, Bulgaria, by that time, it was a gradual process that began in 1877, but by 1908, Bulgaria had officially seceded from the Ottoman Empire, and a recognized state border ran just north of the city of Edirne. Still, the province continued to be a place of striking ethno-religious diversity, even by Ottoman standards. It was home to about 620,000 Muslims, 340,000 Orthodox Greeks, 120,000 Bulgarian Christians, 26,000 Armenians, and 24,000 Jews. That's Edirne province. Intercommunal violence was relatively rare, but daily life was very much structured along ethno-religious lines. And that holds for much of the Ottoman Empire. For example, the Jews of Edirne were governed by Ottoman authorities, obviously, but also a local Jewish council and a regional chief rabbi. If a Jew fell sick, he or she would probably be treated by the local Bikur Cholim society, the Visiting the Sick society. Jewish children attended Talmud Torah schools, or increasingly, schools run by the Alliance Israelite Universelle, an international Jewish organization based in Paris that was sort of dedicated to educating and regenerating Jews of the East broadly defined to include Morocco, for example, with the mission of helping Jews achieve emancipation and full citizenship by making them more French. Much of the funding for these institutions came from the largesse of Jewish merchants and a sales tax on kosher foods, the gabella. Meanwhile, the border of the Ottoman Empire remained relatively easy to cross in the early 20th century. Edirne Jews continued to visit Bulgaria, a young country that was home to many of their fellow Ladino speakers and family members in some cases. In fact, the train ride to Plovdiv, Bulgaria, I'll hover over it right here, was probably easier than the train ride to Ottoman Salonika, now called Thessaloniki. The latter entailed a long stop in Drama, where the Ottoman authorities disinfected the train cars, inspected documents, and recorded the names of all passengers. In Southeast Europe, circa 1908, the boundaries between Ottoman provinces or ethno-religious communities were no less formidable than the borders between states. Bulgaria declared its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1908, but more famously, that was the year of the Young Turk Revolution. After a group of officers and bureaucrats forced the Sultan to restore parliament and reinstate the Ottoman constitution, Edirne's Muslims, Christians, and Jews celebrated the dawn of a liberal era. Intercommunal unity, ittihad in Turkish, became the watchword of the revolution, and new freedoms of the press and association allowed newspapers and clubs to proliferate. Okay, speaking of newspapers, so here's an example from the Jewish community. This is a Ladino paper that started in 1910 called La Voz de la Verdad, the voice of truth. Um, the founder and editor was a man named Yosef Bar Yitzchak. And this was made available to me through the National Library of Israel. It's held there and also at the Yad Ben Tzvi Institute, sort of a related institution in Israel. So what emerged at this time, however, was not a general public sphere, so much as several public spheres, plural. Muslims read newspapers printed in Turkish, Orthodox Greeks read papers printed in Greek, Bulgarian Christians had newspapers in Bulgarian, Armenians had papers written in Armenian, and, after 1910, Jews had this newspaper published in Ladino. Edirne's Jewish newspaper urged its readers to see themselves as, quote, Ottoman and Jewish at the same time, as members of both the Pueblo Otomano and the Nación Judía, the Ottoman people, and the Jewish nation. According to the editor, Bar Yitzchak, these two roles were perfectly compatible because defending the interests of the Jewish community involved exercising the rights and freedoms granted by the new Ottoman constitution. In fact, Edirne Jews were so emboldened by the promise of the revolution that a Jewish protest in 1910 erupted into a shootout between protesters and police. Miraculously, no one was killed. Several Jews were arrested, but all were eventually acquitted. The Edirne incident, as it was dubbed by the Jewish press in Istanbul, became something of a Rorschach test. Some saw in it the government's commitment to the rule of law. Others saw it as a sign that Jewish political activity in the Ottoman borderland could not exceed certain limits, even in an age of liberty. In terms of political energy and population size, Edirne's Jewish community reached its peak in the years following the Young Turk Revolution, the years when this newspaper was first published. But by the fall of 1912, this era was coming to a close. The pivotal event was the Balkan Wars. When a coalition led by Bulgaria and Greece attacked the Ottoman Empire, Edirne's Bulgarian and Greek speakers suddenly became suspect in the eyes of their Turkish-speaking neighbors. The arrival of Muslim refugees from the Balkans only reinforced the idea that local Christians no longer had a place in Edirne. But with no enemy state claiming to represent them, local Jews faced fewer questions about their political loyalties. Some of them made strong displays of their Ottoman patriotism. For example, many young men fought in the Ottoman army, and one became the first Jewish officer in Ottoman history. Another example of such patriotism can be seen in this photograph. It shows two Jewish women volunteering with their Muslim male colleagues at Edirne's military hospital during Bulgaria's siege of the city. Their patriotism was soon recognized in an official letter of gratitude from the governor of Edirne province. So this is a version of this photograph, made it onto the cover of my book. Here we see Angel Giron and Rosa Avigdor. And this is Angel Giron. This is Rosa Avigdor. And I know their story. This picture doesn't say much, right? It shows us there they are, and there's a version with everyone's names written in Ottoman Turkish, basically in Arabic letters. Everyone's at the bottom. It shows everyone's name written like in the corresponding place to where they're standing. But I know the backstory from documents in the archive of the Alliance Israelite Universelle. And in fact, Angel Giron kept a diary, a journal, during the siege that she wrote in French because she was unable to correspond. She was both actually Angela Gueron and Rosa Avigdor were teachers in local Alliance girls' schools, and normally they would write these reports to their bosses in Paris every other week. They were unable to do so during the war, during the siege of Edirne. So Angela Gueron sort of kept a journal in lieu of that, just documenting what was happening in the city, and eventually sent it to Paris when the war ended and train service resumed. And this remains one of our best sources about the siege of Edirne, regarding not just the Jewish community, but Edirne in general. And it talks about how these two women volunteered at the military hospital. It documents certain conflicts with the chief rabbi and Bar Ischak, the editor of the Ladino paper. I think that these two men who sort of ran the community kind of resented the growing sort of influence that these two women were having. The letter of thanks they received from the Vali. The two men saw that as a challenge to their authority in the community, and they often butt heads. In March 1913, so despite a sort of heroic resistance to the Bulgarian siege, Ottoman Edirne finally capitulated, and Bulgarian forces occupied the city of Edirne. Local Jews had little choice but to accept that they now lived in a region called New Bulgaria. Despite her pro-Ottoman sentiments, even Angela Gueron adjusted quickly to the new reality. Her responsibilities as director of the local Alliance Girls' School compelled her to work with Bulgarian Jewish leaders in a wider effort to reorganize the school network and rebuild the region. When Ottoman forces retook the city a few months later, Gueron wrote a joyous entry in her journal. But she also noted that the Ottomans could learn a thing or two from the departing Bulgarians. For example, the Slavic occupiers had quickly required all business to be done in Bulgarian, while the Ottomans, in contrast, had never forced people to use Ottoman Turkish. Quote, "The Turks are more tolerant," wrote Gueron, "but I believe they are wrong, at least regarding language. Their non-Muslim citizens would be more attached to the Ottoman nation if they spoke the language of the Ottomans." And here there's a few things I'll point out in this photograph. You can see Bulgarian flags in the background, Selimiye Mosque in the far background, and some sort of uniformed Bulgarian. I'm not sure if he's an officer or just maybe some sort of street patrolman in the foreground. You can see a veiled Muslim woman in the bottom left. There are not there are many photographs of late Ottoman Edirne, but very few that show a street scene. Actually, I think the only photograph I could find that showed a sort of lively street scene was during the Bulgarian occupation. And it's a Russian photographer. While the Ottomans managed to reclaim the city of Edirne, the Balkan Wars and their aftermath left tremendous scars on the region. The Ottomans lost most of their Balkan territory, hundreds of thousands of Muslims fled that zone, and a similar number of Ottoman Christians were forced out of the Edirne region and western Anatolia. In Edirne province, the Jewish community was about the only group not subjected to campaigns of ethnic cleansing at this time. Surrounded by a swirl of violence and compelled to adopt a more cautious style of politics, we might say the Jews of Edirne were in the eye of the storm. For Muslims and Christians, the border was becoming a sorter of ethno-religious groups, each of which was supposed to have its own state. So the logic went. In contrast, local Jews still did not see the border as a limit to their zone of belonging, and they continued to associate and identify with Ladino speakers across the Balkans. What is true today was already true then. Borders mean different things to different people. Sadly, the Edirne region would continue to be gripped by violence. This map shows the region in 1915, after both Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire joined World War I on the side of Germany and Austria. In a bid to get Bulgaria to join the Central Powers, the Ottomans gave their neighbor a strip of land on the west bank of the Maritsa River, over here. That, combined with the territorial losses of the Balkan Wars, caused the border to almost surround the city of Edirne. It was in this context that the Armenian genocide, which started near the Ottoman border with Russia in the east, reached the Ottoman borderland near Bulgaria. Throughout Edirne province, and especially in the port city of Tekirdağ, Armenian citizens of the Ottoman Empire were rounded up, loaded onto cattle cars, and sent to die in the Syrian desert. Contemporary Jewish sources are largely silent on the episode. Presumably, Jews were afraid to write anything that might inflame the Ottoman authorities at this time. So I found no direct reference to what was happening to the Armenians in Jewish sources. World War I was hardly a good period for the Jews of Edirne, as evidenced by the fact that wealthier community members were leaving the borderland for Istanbul. But once again, Edirne Jews did not become victims of ethnic cleansing. In fact, they sometimes proved useful in the Ottoman-Bulgarian wartime alliance. For example, the above-mentioned editor, Yosef Bar Ishak, temporarily left the newspaper business for a job at the Ottoman consulate in Bulgarian Karaach, just across the river. Before long, he was sent on a diplomatic mission to Sofia. So there are other examples of this, of Sephardi, Ladino-speaking Sephardi Jews in Bulgaria and in Ottoman Edirne sort of proving useful in this Ottoman-Bulgarian alliance. So the way that the Sephardi Jewish community crossed borders could potentially be a nuisance to the state or potentially an asset for the state, as it was for both Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire during World War I. Jumping ahead 5 years with this map, 1920. After the Ottomans lost World War I, the Edirne region, now called Eastern Thrace, was again occupied by a foreign country. But this time, it was Greece, not Bulgaria. The Greek annexation of Thrace became official in the summer of 1920. In nearby Kavala, a local Jew spoke the following words at a public celebration. Kavala is right somewhere around here, east of Salonika. So a local Jew spoke the following words at a public celebration. From Epirus to Edirne, over 300,000 Jews wildly applauded the victories of this valiant and heroic people, the Greek people. Today in Thrace, the sun shines brighter. Over the entire region flies this blue and white striped flag. The Greek flag, however, would not be the only blue and white banner to appear in Eastern Thrace around this time. Zionism, which had been slow to take hold in Edirne during the late Ottoman period, quickly gained popularity among local Jewish communities, only to vanish from public life when the Greek occupation ended in 1922. The Greek administration largely approved of Zionism, which was seen as a fellow nationalist movement fighting for secession from the Ottoman Empire, resonances with Greek nationalism. After 1922, Zionism would be hated by the Turkish government for the same reason. Zionist societies appeared in Eastern Thrace as early as 1919, when the region was visited by a representative of the Zionist Federation of the East, based in Istanbul. By 1921, the city of Edirne was home to chapters of Shivat Zion, Return to Zion, Serei Zion, Youth of Zion, Bnei Zion, Sons of Zion, and Benot Zion, Daughters of Zion. When the British Mandate for Palestine was ratified in 1922, 3,000 people filled the Great Synagogue of Edirne to celebrate, at least according to my sources. Other sources say that the synagogue had a max capacity of 1,000. So, I don't know. Maybe people were standing. Maybe people were pressed close together. Young members of the Maccabi Sports Club wore their blue and white uniforms, and the Jewish orphanage brass band played the Greek national anthem, followed by Hatikva. However, this was a largely symbolic Zionism that had more to do with local factors and practical considerations than with a Jewish state in Palestine or with official ideology. Constant political flux and uncertainty about the future pushed many Edirne Jews toward a version of Zionism that provided a neutral path in treacherous political terrain, ironically. In a disputed borderland where the only political certainty seemed to be the presence of a nation state, as opposed to any particular nation state, Jews employed a vague form of Zionism that was useful less for what it meant than for what it avoided, namely other nationalisms. For the Jews of Eastern Thrace, modern nationalism was not an exciting chance to break with the past so much as a dangerous, obligatory game in which the safest strategy could be a modified version of Zionism that evoked old patterns of communal autonomy from the Ottoman era. Okay, the Edirne region in 1923 is the title of this map. To an extent, this strategy paid off when the Greeks, both the military administration and everyday civilians, were ousted from the region by the Turkish national movement. When Edirne became part of the new Republic of Turkey, local Jews could plausibly claim that they had not been pro-Greek so much as pro-Jewish. With that said, Zionist activity ceased or was forced underground during the first decade of the Turkish Republic. From 1923 to 1933, the Jews of Edirne experienced pressure to assimilate in the cultural realm and resentment in the economic realm. Still, this was a relatively peaceful time compared to the period 1912 to 1922. This picture also I found in the digital archive of the Alliance shows Jewish cheesemakers in Edirne circa the interwar period. Let's just say. By the way, I'm slightly I'm assuming they are Jewish cheesemakers, right? Sometimes I think we have to make some assumptions, safe assumptions as historians. I think the photo, the only caption was cheesemakers. I found it in a Jewish archive. I'm gonna say 98% chance they are Jewish cheesemakers, but I don't know any additional information about them. I mean, it's also possible, maybe two of them are Jewish and two of them are Muslim employees, Turkish-speaking Muslim employees. I don't know, but it was found. They are Jewish cheesemakers in Edirne, and the photo is from a Jewish archive. In the summer of 1934, after an official from the Turkish government toured the region and met privately with local leaders, the Jews of Eastern Thrace were attacked by their neighbors in a week of violence that spurred a Jewish exodus from the borderland. The so-called Thrace events remain the only case of mob violence against Jews in the history of the Turkish Republic. It is no coincidence that they occurred in a geopolitically sensitive border zone. A process that had started around 1912 was completed in 1934. The borderland was now untenable for all large groups of minorities. Today, no Jews live in Edirne. There are, by the way, a couple families who own stores. Last I checked, actually, I'm not sure if this is still the case. There's a family called the Mitrani family. They live in Istanbul but own a supermarket in Edirne, and there's another family that owns a gas station in Kirklareli, and they live also in Istanbul, and they sort of, go out to run the store, to tend the store, but don't live full time in this region. So that concludes the core of my talk, but I'll say a few things maybe about the research process and sources and archives. Maybe this will be interesting since, after all, this is a genealogy society. My most useful archives, for one, the Alliance Israelite Universelle Archive. The digital stuff for photographs was very helpful, but the documents of the Jewish community, the documents, especially the reports that teachers from the Alliance schools sent on a bi-weekly basis to Paris, were a real a core of my source base, and they are mostly scanned and available online. Usually, you will need access through like a university that subscribes. I don't think it's all just publicly available on the Alliance website, although that may have changed. And I also went in person to Paris to get some additional documents that were not scanned. Largely, though, they are scanned, and they are a really rich source because these teachers are sending these twice a week reports to Paris. They're talking about the schools and how the students are doing and all that, but they're also talking about the political situation, relations with the Ottoman Turkish authorities, um, sort of language politics, debates within the Jewish community about teaching Hebrew versus French. How many hours a week should be allotted to teaching Hebrew versus to teaching French, versus after 1908 to teaching Turkish. So these are really important issues in terms of the history of the Jewish community. Another very important source was that newspaper, which I'll go back to. La Voz de la Verdad. I mean, I read more or less all existing issues. Started in 1910. It came out twice a week. It was interrupted by the Balkan Wars in the fall of 1912, and then, pardon me, it was sort of intermittently published. Yeah, again, the publishing, the history of the run of the newspaper reflects the instability in the region. It stops during the Balkan Wars, then it gets started again in 1914, and then it stops again during World War One. It starts again during the Greek occupation. The publisher, Boris Schak, obviously got permission from the Greek authorities. Two Jewish newspapers actually appear during the Greek occupation in 1921. La Voz de la Verdad reappears, and then a French language newspaper called L'Echo d'Andrinople. Andrinople is the French term. Adrianople is the English term. Andrinople is the French. And a young Jewish man publishes a Jewish newspaper in French, also during the Greek occupation. A few issues exist. And La Voz de la Verdad intermittently is published in the 1920s. And this, again, is held at the National Library of Israel / Yad Ben Zvi, the Ben Zvi Institute. Other Ladino newspapers from Istanbul, for example, would regularly report on sort of news from the provinces, which could be helpful. I also went to Jerusalem a few years ago to the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People, which the archives organized by the location of the community. So there is like I think they had how many boxes? Maybe 20 or more boxes just labeled Edirne. And these are the communal records. This is like the chief rabbinate and the central office of the Jewish community. So there's a lot of day-to-day kind of mundane stuff, but mixed in, if you have the patience to go through it all, there are some very interesting documents that help me understand what was going on in the community. And you'll find Ladino, Hebrew, Turkish, French in those archives. So yeah, these were some of the most helpful source bases and archives for me. I also went to the Ottoman archives in Istanbul. Both the Ottoman archives ends up being like a shorthand for both the Ottoman period, but then also the Turkish state archives after 1923, and that was also very helpful. There were some cases where, for example, I mentioned this shootout with police when the Jews engaged in a shootout with police in the Jewish quarter of Edirne in 1910. And there I was able to get the Jewish side of the story from the Allianz archives, and I could compare it with the Ottoman chief of police, his official incident report, which I found in the Ottoman archives. And I could compare the two accounts. And Ottoman, so this is what Ottoman Turkish looks like in the center here, right? Written in the Arabic script. It wasn't until 1928 that Ataturk changed the alphabet to the Latin alphabet. So I'm happy to take any questions about the content, the research process, anything at all.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I thought especially with the maps because we kind of sort of know about borders moving, but generally you see the, before Balkan Wars and after Balkan Wars
Yeah,
maps
yeah,
without the complexity in between.
yeah,
Um, did you look at consular
yeah.
archives
I
in
did. I did.
Edirne? Because a few years ago, Jacob Marachi and I were doing some genealogical research on a family, and the family were under Spanish protection, and Jacob sort of sent off for the Spanish consular archives, and it just came back with absolutely massive
Mm,
information
mm, mm.
about this particular family.
Yeah, actually, I forgot to mention. Thank you. I spent some time down
Okay,
down the
okay.
down the street from you at Kew at the National Archives of the UK, and that was also very helpful. They have all the consular reports from Edirne, and to my dismay, some of the consuls had really weird handwriting. I mean, I after doing all this research and all these foreign languages, I was so excited to finally work with English language sources, and just my luck, the British consul in Edirne had this really weird idiosyncratic handwriting that took me such a long time to get used to, but eventually I got used to it. And that was very helpful. Of course, you have to take everything with a grain of salt. But especially again in cases where I could compare different people's accounts of the same event, that really helped me provide a more nuanced story. There, unlucky for me, I was in contact with um, the archives in France, archivists in France. I was hoping to get the French equivalent, the archives of the French consuls in Edirne, which were supposed to be in Nantes. Um, they disappeared. They told me. They said, "Oh, we're so sorry. For some reason, the papers from the French consul in Edirne for the period I wanted cannot be located."
Okay. Another question is my kind of mental map. Um, at least after the railroads were put in,
Yeah.
is we have one sort of going up through a monastery through Bitola up to
Mm,
Sarajevo and so on, and of
mm,
course coming down to Thessalonica and presumably, actually, I've been along that railway when I was a student interrailing, but through Edirne into Istanbul. To what degree was the trade of the city damaged? Because presumably, when the borders went up, was Thessalonica their major port, or was it sort of Istanbul or Gallipoli or somewhere else? And
yeah.
and and and, and essentially, how did these borders going up impact the trade of the city?
So, short answer, the borders were devastating for the trade of the city, no doubt. And I mean, you can just sort of, again, I'll show the story in maps. This, again, not a state border, just the province border. From really a central place in southeastern Europe. The train, the trains are built by Baron Hirsch. A great book about Baron Hirsch, by the way, by my colleague Matthias Lemon, came out a couple years ago. The railway is built by Baron Hirsch. I want to say in the 1870s, 1880s. That was good in many ways, good for Edirne. It further sort of entrenched this inland city into various like Balkan networks. Um, but by with each successive border revision, Edirne gets more and more cut off from its hinterland, right? I mean, these regions to the west and northwest were sort of part of the local economy. A lot of crops came from there, and that gets way more complicated with new state tariffs and whatnot. And especially, I think in the early days of these new states, like the new Republic of Turkey, there's really an effort to create more of a national economy and, make Ankara the center of this economic national world. And Edirne definitely suffers from its
Yeah.
situation on the border, and that's why I think the first Jews to leave en masse are the merchants.
Yeah.
So, which of course is devastating to the local community. By the interwar period, it's a very poor Jewish community.
And one last question from me on archives.
Yeah.
First of all, do Sharia court records
Mm.
exist for the city? Because sometimes they can be quite useful for Sephardic research.
Yeah.
And secondly, I'd be untoward if I didn't ask about earlier records going back to 1500. Have you come across any sources for those?
So for the early modern period, I rely on other people's research.
Okay.
Um, just had to draw the lines somewhere, and so I didn't do any primary source research with records from the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, but some good studies have been done. There's a guy, his name is it Karagedikli, I want to say is his name. He is a professor somewhere in Turkey, I forget where. It's actually his master's thesis, which um something very unusual for Turkish master's thesis. He wrote it in English. And yeah, I want to say it's Karagedikli, like Karagedikli or something like that. And he wrote a nice master's thesis years ago when he was younger about the Jewish community of Edirne in the early modern period. And he seems to have done some good, proper primary source research using Sharia court records and other Ottoman sources like that. Yes, there certainly are Sharia court records that one could access. I did not go there. Again, I can't do it all. I didn't get too involved in the court records, which those Sharia court records are anyway more relevant for the early modern period.
Great. Thank you. Tom,
And,
over to you.
and I'll say, Tom, before if I may, before you start,
Yeah.
um, because David, you had said something about like ports, and that's that's something worthwhile that I kind of glossed over. You know, notice Edirne is not a port city. At least it doesn't have a seaport, and that's significant. That creates a very different socioeconomic scene compared to the more famous Sephardi communities in Salonika over here or Istanbul over here. So it makes the story a bit of a fresh story. We're used to these cosmopolitan ports when we think Ottoman Jews, right? Izmir down here. This is a different story. It's inland. There's less of a Western European influence. The influence of Western European merchants is quite small, and the influence of these Italian Jews known as Francos is also quite small. These Italian Jews who were very important agents of modernity and Westernization in Salonika, Izmir, and Istanbul are largely absent from Edirne. So we have a lower level of influence coming from Western Europe, nevertheless very diverse. So it's a different sort of cosmopolitan. It depends on your definition of cosmopolitan. And for many years, Edirne it's on the Maritsa River, as you can see here, and there's a port down at the bottom of the river, and this was kind of the waterway between Edirne and the sea. But this river sort of silted up over the years, and you can see today it's not much of a river, but the train really became the very important artery for the merchants of Edirne. And Tekirdağ was the principal port of the region, although the train probably um, was detrimental to the commerce of Tekirdağ because suddenly, it was less important to ship things through Tekirdağ, and inland commerce through Edirne was easier.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for this talk. And could you write the name of that last writer into chat?
Yeah. I'm going to, if you give me just a second, let me
Yeah,
confirm the spelling here. 1 second.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right, here it is. I may have to, I may have to stop share to do that. I'm not sure if I'm able to do that. I can just the old fashioned, I mean, do you want me to just write it on a piece of paper? Or do you want me to stop the share?
Oh, you
I,
can stop sharing.
okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think now he writes about other topics. It's just sort of a weird, it's like a weird kind of coincidence that for some reason his master's thesis was about the Jews of Edirne, and it's in English.
Yeah. Um, Question about the Jews of Edirne. Were they all Sephardic, or is it more complicated?
Good question. By the modern period, for all intents and purposes, it's basically an all Sephardic community. I mean, the history, of course, as people here probably know, is more complicated. Um, there were Romaniote Jews in this region once upon a time, but they assimilated into the Sephardi culture, language, rite, and there's no other synagogue. Let's put it that way. All of the synagogues are Sephardi synagogues. So if there were other kinds of Jews, they didn't really leave a trace in terms of their organizations. All organizational life, all mentions are just Sephardi. And when exactly that happened is hard. It's hard to say when exactly, you know, everyone assimilated to the Sephardi way, but certainly by the time period in my book.
Um, you said that after 1934, most Jews left Edirne to Constantinople. Have you been able to trace of some of these people, or more of them? What happened to them in World War II?
Yes, I have not done sort of in-depth studies of individuals in that sense, but the so 2 points. The actually the epilogue to my book is about World War II and the Holocaust. And the Nazis come up to the border. Nazi Germany occupies the northeastern corner of Greece. So even though Bulgaria occupied most of Thrace, um, the Nazis go to the very northeastern corner of Greece. The Dimotiko infamously was really the Jewish community was destroyed. The Nazis deported virtually the whole community to Auschwitz. Across the border, the Jews of Edirne were safe for various reasons. I mean, Turkey stayed neutral during the war, and the Germans didn't cross the border. So, um, on the one hand, there's um, a very devastating thing that the Turkish government did during World War II called the wealth tax. The Varlıkvergisi, they levied like a ridiculous tax against Jews and Christians during the war, claiming it was like to help the war effort or to as a reprisal against profiteering. It was wealth transfer. And this is referred to. If anyone's seen the Netflix show The Club um, from a couple years ago, very good drama series. I recommend it. Um, this shows up in that historical fictional show. Many Jewish families in Turkey were devastated by this tax that was designed really, to take the wealth of non-Muslims. With that said, the Holocaust doesn't reach Turkey, so no Jews are deported. Many of the Jews who would eventually leave for Istanbul would go to Israel after 1948. So there's sort of, you don't see a lot of Jews going straight from Edirne to Israel. I mean, before or after 1948, but eventually many of those names, I've just done some, it's sort of beyond the period of my book, but from taking a quick look and reading some of the newspapers, the Jewish newspapers of Istanbul at that time, it's clear that many Edirne Jews who moved to Istanbul will then go to Israel, probably in the same proportion as, the longtime Istanbul Jews. Also, it's worth mentioning on the topic of World War II, and this also comes up in the epilogue to my book, Turkey did not do much to help Turkish Jews who were living abroad. In fact, some laws were passed during the interwar period laws were passed quietly saying that, oh, if you're living abroad, you have to renew your citizenship within, X amount of time at the local consulate or else you lose it. And many Jews didn't get the news or just weren't able to renew their citizenship, and they were left high and dry. In the Holocaust, they were largely unable to seek refuge in Turkey. But those Jews who were citizens of Turkey living in the borders of Turkey were safe from the Holocaust, though very much exposed to this wealth tax.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else with questions? Jacob Rosen. You are muted, Jacob. Can't hear you. Oh, sorry. Now you're muted.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for this quite new topic for me. Though I came across very short episode, which I want to mention to the audience. There was a Jewish family, Bermorias, from Adrianople, who somehow, for economic reasons, at the beginning of the 20th century, moved in to what is now Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, to Brno, Brunn in German, Brno. And their son it was then part of the Austrian Empire. Their son was drafted to the Austrian army during World War I. He knew Turkish, he knew German, and he was sent out of all places to the front in Palestine. And he was wounded in the British bombardment on Gaza in 1917, was wounded, was transferred to the Austrian hospital in Jerusalem, and he died. He was soldier, he was interpreter between the Turkish and German and Austrian officers, and he died in the hospital. And the Turkish authorities came to the Chevra Kadisha in Jerusalem and said, here we have an Austrian soldier. So the Chevra Kadisha buried him in the Ashkenazi section of Mount of Olives section, Ashkenazi. Well, long story short, we made some research. We found it was Behmorias that was actually Turkish. We found his second generation niece, and few years, 2006, a big burial, a big ceremony was done. A matzeva was put on his grave. It was transferred to the Sephardic section, and in the presence of the Austrian and Hungarian military attaches, because it was their soldier, and of course representatives of the Israeli army, and I was somehow involved there. It's very interesting how
Mm,
Jewish family from Adrianople, Edirne,
yeah.
there, and what a confusion it started, but finally it was sorted out. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Very interesting. Yeah, that name, Behmoros, is a prominent family in Edirne, and many of the chief rabbis were from that family.
Yeah. So a niece is living in London.
Hmm.
David, for
Fascinating.
you.
Fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
No more questions? Okay, then we can wrap it up.
Who does that? Who wraps it up? You or me?
I will, unless you have famous last words.
Please, please. My last words are thank you all for having me. This was really
Yeah.
delightful.
This was Sephardic World, brought to you by the Sephardic Genealogical Society. As always, we thank our patrons who make all of this possible. And above all, we thank our talker today, Jacob Daniels. Thank you very much, and see you all in 2 weeks' time.